So welcome everyone. Just turn my camera on. Are we already sharing? Perfect. I think we'll wait one more minute before we start, just in case there are anyone or any more people joining online, and we'll just start like 2 past. So just hang tight and we'll be starting shortly. Welcome if you've just joined. We're just letting the last couple people in and we'll start in just one moment. A few more in the waiting room. Right. Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. It's really nice to see people here in the room and also in our virtual room on Zoom. My name is Luna Dolezal. I am based at the Wellcome Centre for Cultures and Environments of Health at the University of Exeter, and also the PI of the Shame and Medicine Project. And we're really happy to be having a seminar today here in our centre and as part of our Shame and Medicine seminar series with Fred Cooper. So I'm now going to introduce. Fred and I've worked extensively together on a project called Scenes of Shame and Stigma in COVID with Arthur Rose as well. And he used to be based in this centre for many years and also did his PhD here at Exeter. Fred is a historian of medicine and has worked extensively on loneliness and more recently on shame and stigma and now on epistemic injustice, and really delighted to have Fred here. His talk, as you can see, is called Carmita Wood, in her own words, Shame, Loneliness and Epistemic Injustice at a Speak Out on Sexual Harassment in Ithaca in 1975. And this is part of the work he's doing for the EPIC project at the University of Bristol. So I'm going to hand it over to Fred, who I think is going to speak for about half an hour. Let's see, and then we'll have questions after. So the session will end at 2. But yeah, go ahead, Fred.
Thanks, Luna, and thank you everyone for coming. It's good to be here. So my talk today is part of a side project that I'm kind of very much right at the beginning of, assembling and interpreting archival traces of a woman called Carmita Wood, a victim and, as we'll see, a co-articulator of sexual harassment at Cornell University in the mid-1970s. If Carmita Wood's story is familiar to you in some form already, there's a good chance you're a historian of second-wave feminism, a scholar of sexual harassment, or a philosopher of epistemic injustice, a concept that Miranda Fricker used Wood's case to help define in her famous 2007 book, Epistemic Injustice, Power and the Ethics of Knowing. I call this a side project, but it's also an important part of a book I'm writing at the moment about epistemic injustice and loneliness. So in this draft, at least, the book begins with Wood, a classic example, much discussed and contested by epistemologists, of someone supposedly unable to put her experiences into words, but also someone who, when she did write or speak, repeatedly emphasized how alone she felt. Fricker notes that Wood and women with similar experiences, in Fricker's words, struggled in isolation to make proper sense of their various experiences of harassment, while the whole engine of collective social meaning was effectively geared to keeping these obscured experiences out of sight. Apart from this quite brief aside, though, Wood's aloneness and her shame barely survived the analysis and reanalysis of her case. I think there are very precise reasons, though, why they should. And this has turned into a wider set of questions about what affordances historical methodologies can have for a story which was only ever fleetingly Wood's to begin with. So the paper will take the following form. I'll introduce Carmita Wood, what happened to her and what she did, with sincere apologies to anyone here who kind of already knows much of this stuff. I'll briefly trace out what I think of as her two afterlives in history and feminist epistemology, neither of which have shown very much curiosity, I think, over how she narrated her own life. Taking two instances, both in 1975, where she made decisive recorded acts of communication, so a speak out on sexual harassment in the workplace, and a short article titled Woman Alone. I'll spend some time with how she said her victimization and also her activism each made her feel. Reading her words alongside those of the other women who took to the stage to speak, I'll argue that many of the layers of meaning added later, particularly around epistemic barriers to understanding and agency, were very much present in the room at the time. But the Wood and her fellow speakers made sense of them instead through interconnected languages of loneliness and shame. In terms of content, I've tried to keep my accounts of what these women went through as sparse as possible, with the exception of one experience, which is kind of mostly just really bizarre, but I think bears discussing. Nevertheless, I really hope it goes without saying that I want you to prioritize how you're feeling overhearing my talk. So please do leave the room or the Zoom as and if you need to. So this is the only photograph I've been able to find purporting to be Carmita Wood, supplied by her family for her obituary on legacy.com. I say purporting because this has kind of given me no end of a headache, because quite a few philosophers in their work describe Carmita Wood as a black woman, and I've kind of I have found bizarrely hard to find out either way, and this isn't the most kind of reliable thing. I did find a correction to an article in The Nation, rolling back on having described her as a black woman and correcting the record to say that she was in fact white. I've treated her as a white woman in the sense that I haven't gone into any of the kind of questions about intersectionality, for example, that otherwise would raise. But it's slightly strange and hard to find out, which is in and of itself quite interesting, I think. So Wood was an administrative assistant at the Laboratory of Nuclear Studies at Cornell in the early 1970s. She was the first woman to hold the post, when an eminent physicist called Boyce McDaniel started to sexually harass her. The university still has a meadow named after him. I should say that I'm leaning heavily here on Susan Brown-Miller's 1990 book, In Our Time, Memoir of a Revolution, and Carrie Baker's much more recent work, The Women's Movement Against Sexual Harassment. And either of those, if you want to kind of find out about this in more depth, can give you a fuller background than I will today. Mostly for reasons of time. I'm not going to list or describe in detail the form that McDaniel's harassment took, but it moved between profoundly uncomfortable private acts and behaviour that seemed to aim at a kind of more ritualised public humiliation. So Wood described him as a dirty old man who didn't want her on the job. And I really like this because I think it nicely collapses the kind of more overt sexual motivation for what he was doing and how he did it, with its underlying disciplinary purpose, in deliberately making work unsafe for a woman he didn't think should be there. I'll return to this point later, not least because it's something that gets lost in subsequent discussions over whether and how Wood and McDaniel each understood what was happening. So Wood developed significant neck and back pains in March 1974 with no clear physical cause. She left her job in June, applied for unemployment insurance, but was denied it when the New York State Department of Labor ruled that she'd left for, and I quote, personal, non-compelling reasons. I'm again not quite sure what to say about that first hearing. So much has been made of Carmita Wood not being able to understand, articulate, or communicate what had happened to her in that moment. So this forms the basis of Fricker's analysis, which I'll come back to. So I'm currently waiting for the documents for Wood's appeal. to the board, which I do have, found against her a second time on the grounds that she hadn't been in contact with her harasser for 6 months after she left, and that she'd stated she wanted to move somewhere warmer to ease her chronic pain. To me, this suggests something probably closer to disbelief over motivation than like a real inability to find a shared language. Denied insurance, Wood sought out the director of Cornell's Human Studies program, Lin Farley. The work they did together resulted in the formation of a campaigning organisation, Working Women United, and a journal, Labour Pains. They also crucially contributed and popularised a new composite term, sexual harassment, which didn't exist before, to stake out a particular set of behaviours and experiences which had been quite difficult to formally name. So this was a strikingly successful epistemic project. Working Women United identified and corrected a real shortfall in the language available to describe a devastating and common form of predatory oppression. An important moment in this process, which ultimately included years of work to get the term on a legal footing, took the form of a speak out in Ithaca on the 4th of May 1975, with an estimated 275 attendees and well over a dozen speakers, including Wood. So Lin Farley published a book in 1978, Sexual Shakedown, The Sexual Harassment of Women on the Job, which Susan Brown-Miller then drew on for In Our Time. Carmita Wood, or a particular version of her, then recurs in later histories of feminism, usually as this kind of catalytic but transient figure, quickly present, and as she left Ithaca and the activist scene there when her appeal failed in October 1975, very quickly gone. Probably harder to predict, perhaps, Wood then has a second academic afterlife through the feminist epistemologist Miranda Fricker's decision to use her experience via Brown-Miller's account as a case study for a phenomenon she termed hermeneutic injustice in the mid-2000s. In an analysis which has become seminal in shaping an entire field of study, Fricker contended that Wood was unable to sufficiently understand what had happened to her, due to an unjust lacuna in collective interpretive resources, the conceptual non-existence, thus far, of sexual harassment, which she would go on to help resolve. Such a lacuna was able to occur, Fricker argued, because women have been denied equal access to the levers of epistemic life. Fricker's interpretation has been much nuanced and much criticised, and Wood's case extensively relitigated in the process. Critics have noted that Fricker frames Wood as a confused and passive epistemic subject, rather than a woman actively engaged in making meaning through repeated acts of epistemic struggle. They also note that lacunas in interpretive resources are rarely lacunas for everyone, and that a gap or silence in male-dominated professional and legalistic languages is not the same as a gap in understanding amongst a group, in this instance working women experiencing the oppression. What I find most interesting here, though, is that the truth of Wood's case, whatever there is to be had, has at times become a kind of stand-in or cipher for truth about the wider phenomenon that Fricker described. If the veils drawn between experience and knowledge are one of the primary concerns of work on epistemic injustice, though, there's a clear warrant to move beyond Miranda Fricker's interpretation of Susan Brown-Miller's interpretation of Lin Farley's interpretation, and start thinking in depth about the echoes that Wood left herself. What Wood's own words do is reassemble a complex emotional life around her decision to place her victimization and her lack of an adequate and formally recognized name for it in sustained epistemic contention. As we'll go on to see, they show Wood and the women who joined her at the Speak Out as reflective and articulate, not just about the lived knowledge of harassment they had, but about the internalized blocks and barriers to forming and sharing it, the political and the personal. One of the organizers of the Speak Out, a colleague of Lin Farley's at Cornell, Karen Sovine, introduced the event as follows. That's how we're going to learn what sexual harassment on the job is really about, by understanding what women who really experienced it really felt. So a specific commitment to feelings during processes of witnessing catharsis and care, but there was also something sharper there, a recognition that the difficult emotions women had about the harassment were a product of the divisive and disorienting tactics used by the men who targeted them. Their aloneness and shame here was something valid to be voiced and dissipated, hopefully, by the group, but also something which had coiled deliberately in their stories to prevent them being told. Indeed, even after hearing the testimonies of a number of the women present, Wood admitted right at the outset that she still felt unable to tell her own. In her words, it's too heavy for me to even talk about. I can't even talk about my own case today. She continued, "We're not alone. I'm not alone. I thought I was alone, you know, until I started this. We're losing our self-respect. We've got to organize. We've got to talk to each other. We've got to be strong, and we've got to forget about this bullshit of being taught to instinctively dislike and distrust each other. All the rules out there are made by men." Wood returned to these themes in the summer in an article for the first issue of Labour Pains titled "Woman Alone." "What does it feel like," she asked, "to be a controversial figure? What happens when you become a public figure involved in an issue that has only been whispered about?" "When I came forward and started to fight against sexual harassment, I was alone. Even though I found a group of wonderful women who were willing to support me in this issue, especially the two women who were my witnesses, I was still alone." At that specific moment, her appeal, in which she put forward a far more polished version of events than she had in her original hearing, had yet to be denied. The narrative Wood adopted aimed at restitution. As she closed the piece, "The great lesson that I have learned is that no one can go through this world alone. Everyone needs other people." But her opening comments muddied this conclusion before it was made, leaving her aloneness, even amid a community of solidarity and purpose, sticky and harder to categorize. Before I talk more about why that was, I want to take a brief detour around the history and politics of aloneness at that particular moment. So feminism in the 1970s had loneliness, and particularly the domestic alienation of mothers and housewives, squarely in its sights. But feminist organizing can also be read in some as militating against the specific aloneness of adverse experience. As Lin put it in her reflections on consciousness raising in Britain, feminist action was a means by which, in her words, all women could learn that their misery, isolation, and feelings of inferiority were not simply personal problems. If the personal is political was an invitation to unravel the complicated and multifarious structures of gender and power in everyday life, work, and relationships, it was also an attempt to impart the lesson that Carmita Wood learned, that the problems she thought she was alone with were in fact held extensively in common, and the systems of oppression and exploitation they resulted from thrived, as Fricker argued, very precisely on knowledge of that commonality being effectively obscured. The Wood complicated this narrative even as she deployed it speaks, I think, to the overlapping meanings that aloneness had for her in that place and time. There was the earlier Carmita Wood, petrified of her boss's advances and trying hard to find a way to leave, whose isolation was constituted primarily from her victimization. Layered around this, though, was a second aloneness, with the first only half dissipated. As she put it, this was the aloneness of the public figure involved in an issue that's only been whispered about, the aloneness of opposed and contested epistemic struggle. What stoked and sustained that second aloneness, I want to argue, was shame. Getting to the point halfway through. In Wood's words, inside me there was fear, self-doubt, and insecurity. Would people look at me with disgust and scorn? Would they think I'd made the whole thing up for some obscure reason of my own? Yes, there were and are people who scorn me. Some think I had a colossal nerve to even bring up the issue. Yes, there are people, some of whom I admired and trusted, who think I made the whole thing up. The painful wedge between Wood and other people, whether as witnesses, listeners, or just plain fellows, was rooted in the shameful anticipation of a series of spoiled identities, both to inhabit and to speak from. So liar, fabulist, troublemaker, can't take a joke, must surely have encouraged or incited him in some way. This was a story that recurred again and again. Contrary to her later depiction as someone who failed to understand, Wood had been clear-sighted that a wrong was being done to her. What she lacked wasn't necessarily knowledge, but an established and agreed upon language to leverage in a series of hostile institutional contexts and encounters. Other women at the Speak Out, for whom the spoiled identities feared by Wood were far more actively internalized, in some ways make for better examples of the phenomenon that Fricker was trying to track. What was decisive here, as we'll go on to see, were the ways that shame made any kind of constructive or collective epistemic action untenable, trapping the women who felt it in mutually confirming cycles of silence and self-recrimination. It took the speak out, a seismic and transformative epistemic event, for the people who attended to pull their stories out of themselves, showing in the breaking precisely what kept them silent, often for years. So I could spend a long time here talking about each of these accounts. So apologies in advance if there are aspects of them I don't unpack enough. But what they do, I think, is demonstrate just how tangled together shame and epistemic effacement or constraint can be. So for Susan, it was the harassment itself and her messy and human reaction to it which made her feel ashamed. In her words, this is all very difficult for me to say. Not only do I feel that what I am saying is unmentionable, but I myself feel shame, that I am admitting something awful about myself. I felt anger, yet a confused anger. I was flattered, I felt insulted and degraded. Another speaker, Carol, detailed an experience which, to me at least, might be better described as a serious sexual assault at the hands of her manager at a department store. Although she considered telling her father, she again, in her words, I felt really disgusting. I didn't talk about it for about 2 years, and I never mentioned it to anyone. And when I thought about why, I realized that I was really ashamed. Like I felt it was something that I had done that had brought this onto me, and that by actually admitting it to someone else, it was just so humiliating and degrading and so perverted, it seemed difficult to imagine that it was completely a one-sided thing. So consequently, I didn't say anything, and I thought that no one would really believe what had happened, that somehow I must have fostered it, I must have been guilty in some way. And I felt that if I'd told anybody about it, they would have thought that I was either really cheap or not worthy of respect, or I just thought that no one would be able to understand it unless they'd actually gone through the situation. So I thought about it. In terms of my interpersonal relationships, I thought about it a lot for years. And the more I thought about it, the more I hated myself for being silent. It made me feel so dehumanized. It made me feel like I wasn't a person, that no one really cared what I was like or was interested in knowing me. Sorry for reading out something long that's also on the screen, but I know sometimes people, I don't know, do chores while like papers are on in the background and so on. What I want to sit with here is just how symbiotic shame and silence were and are, how Carol populated her inner world with imagined reactions to her story, and these worked a devastating harm on her own self-regard. Particularly in the last few lines, she gestured, I think, to a particular kind of epistemic aloneness. As John McGraw puts it, the common conviction by the lonely that they're unknown as to their existence and as to their personal and unique essence. Having experienced something she found it impossible to communicate, something she felt at the time to be in some way defining, circled back into a deeper kind of despondency over the possibility of being known. At the same time, her shame, constantly in motion between anticipation and reality, loaded that possibility of knowing with fear and anxiety. There are, as I've suggested, a number of limitations to Fricker's initial reading of Boyce McDaniel's harassment of Carmita Wood. Making much of the lack of a good term for what Wood experienced, Fricker ends up in this, for me and a fair few others, potentially quite uneasy place where neither party had an interpretive framework for what was happening, with significant epistemic problems on both sides. Although subsequent scholarship has pointed out that Wood then carried out decisive, difficult, and indeed highly historically significant epistemic acts to resolve this trouble with language, McDaniel stays ignorant of what his behaviour is. Indeed, some philosophers have noted that Wood knew more than McDaniel did, and used this point to try and resolve some of the tensions it creates between the usual relationship between knowledge and power. This does get us somewhere, but I think it also sometimes risks letting McDaniel off the hook in a way that Wood and the other women at the Speak Out, in respect of their own harassers, weren't prepared to do. I think I could maybe take the point about a more generalized, but still entirely poisonous and harmful set of misogynistic workplace cultures and interactions. But no woman at the Speak Out described anything less than sustained and knowing victimization, attempts to exploit, subjugate, and shame. I think, contrary to some of the interpretations I've read, that these men understood the gender politics of their workplaces only too well. Indeed, and I have to acknowledge my own positionality here as probably not the best arbiter of this. There was only one moment reading 60 or so pages of testimonies where the interaction described seemed odd and certainly bad, but not necessarily quite so purposeful as the others. So as Deirdre put it, last summer I was working with a colleague on procedural matters. Suddenly, and very much out of the blue, he asked me if my husband and I had ever made love in our pond. He proceeded to describe, I hope the answer was no, just from a, I don't know, hygiene. He proceeded to describe the pleasures of feeling water on one's body and told of a sexual experience he and his wife had shared. I insisted that we return to work, and we did. So months later, though, as she was applying for tenure, she found that he had inserted the following irrevocably into her work record. It's my impression, based upon previous interactions, that if she were given tenure and promotion at this college, she would have total security to lionize some of her more unsuspecting assistant professor colleagues before she ate them in front of others. I think what he means, she continued, is that I would act like a lion, maul them and then devour them. It doesn't take a kind of grounding in psychoanalytical stuff to see the kind of weird reversal kind of going on there. She continued, in various places throughout his writing, he refers to me as, and these are all quotes, hard, authoritarian, self-righteous, arrogant, negative, divisive, bitter, immature, absurd, petty, embarrassing, unprofessional, outrageous, caustic, destructive, dehumanizing, and vicious. So look out for a talk from me in 10 or 15 years, interpreting this one passage through the kind of weird politics of the personnel file and Denise Riley's work on bad words. But for now, I think it stands as an example of the kind of derailing and delegitimizing application of shame via the legitimate, wholly legitimate bureaucratic channels of the workplace that could follow even the most gentle rebuttal. More recent literatures on sexual harassment have mapped out the different forms of institutional betrayal that work to silence victims, including, for example, the extensive use of non-disclosure agreement. One woman at the Speak Out had lost her job and been threatened with libel for escalating a complaint to human resources. There are obvious historically contingent differences here, not least relating to what happens when an idea like sexual harassment gains, at least in theory, legal and professional traction. But the continuities too are hard to ignore. If naming sexual harassment eased the burden of epistemic and institutional struggle, that's very clearly only gone so far. I'm relating all of this in part because this feels like the right moment in respective literatures on epistemic injustice and shame to pull the two closer together. A few months ago, Alexander Edlich and Alfred Archer published an article on stigma and hermeneutical injustice, asking what happens when there are adequate interpretive resources available to understand an experience, for example, on alcoholism, but the stigma around it prevents us from identifying it with our own life. Just 2 days ago, a talk by Lucienne Spencer explored the effects of what she termed epistemic pedantry on people with dementia, when unnecessary corrections to harmless errors erode their identity as epistemic agent. Taking a phenomenological approach, Spencer situated shame as the primary harm of this kind of needless undermining. Perhaps closer to what I'm trying to do here, Christy Dotson's work on testimonial smothering and silencing, in which people contort and redact what they feel they can and can't say, is an obvious lever for thinking at length about the intimate dynamics of shame and epistemic effacement. It matters, I think, that shame and aloneness were in such visible contention in a story which, after several degrees of reconstitution, continues to play a central part in the theorization of epistemic injustice. There's a kind of historical looping at work here, which I want to leave you with. The formulation of sexual harassment was a formidable and clarifying act of epistemic labor, and the same could be said of Fricker's formulation of epistemic injustice. But each were predated by other ways of speaking about the phenomena they describe. Carmita Wood and the other women at the Speak Out didn't have the concept of epistemic injustice, very obviously, to interpret their experiences of internal and institutional silencing, but they theorized them in ways which, with their complex and textured insights into the instrumentality of feeling, still have something significant to relate. In becoming a case study, Wood lost control of her story, but putting her own words back into it, I hope, might possibly shape where it goes next. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh yeah, here you go. So we open the floor for questions. Thank you. That was brilliant. I really enjoyed that talk. And I might stop sharing. Are you sharing?
I am sharing.
Yeah, will you stop sharing
Yeah,
so we can see everyone in the Zoom room? And so I'll alternate between the Zoom room and the physical room where I'm sitting. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. There is a hand. Javi, go ahead. Start with Javi.
Hi, thanks so much. That was really great, Fred. Very, very eloquent as ever and very interesting. I wanted to just maybe push a little bit on this this epistemic realm in relation to specifically these kinds of offenses and violations that are really bodily. And I know you talked about the connection between loneliness, epistemic injustice, and marginalization, but I'm wondering if the body has sort of quite a lot to give us in this account. And my thought is along these lines. I think when somebody is physically and also emotionally and mentally violated in the ways you're describing, the responses that you're describing look irrational if you couch them in epistemic terms. You say, oh, of course you should speak out, of course you should complain, of course you should go to the police. But actually, when you think about a violated body, all a violated body wants to do is to go and hide in a dark corner and forget it ever happened. And I'm wondering if that really, really strong, but also not, inchoate and maybe not entirely conscious and complicated and kind of messy stuff has something to do with the aloneness that you're describing so eloquently. So I just wondered if you think that, in introducing that layer of or that dimension, which is always there, right? I mean, what you're describing is not sort of one intellect assaulting another intellect. These insults, as ever, they could be said with words or hands, but the impact is really deeply bodily. And I thought it was very telling that she complained of, a sort of muscular pain or whatever. And it's sort of thinking about the ways in which humans are animals and the way in which they are wounded in the ways you're describing. And then speaking up becomes a lot harder. And the instinct to just, just completely deny and try and recuperate as quickly as possible becomes overwhelming.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. I think that's really important. As you were saying that, I think there's a text which I'd really like to bring this stuff into tension with. I can't remember if it's either called The Flesh-Shaped Cage or The Flesh-Shaped Prison, I think. And it's around this time or a little before, but it's really kind of trying to understand this this kind of like profound embodied loneliness like within the boundaries of your like physical self. But it kind of pulls out some of the things you're talking about in terms of like, yeah, the kind of the viability of your body, but also the kind of intrinsic aloneness of, you know, anything that can happen to your body is in like a very real sense only happening to you. And I think that would be really useful to think about. Thank you. I've written down what you said. I think that's so helpful. Thank you.
Any questions or comments in the room or further questions online? That's really interesting.
I hope I don't derail, but I was really interested by your comments on, it was one of the quotes that you're reading out about, said, I felt anger, yet a confused anger. And I've been interested in activism for a long time and how sort of activist causes around sort of issues associated with men, and how anger is perceived there like aids and act up, and they're united by anger. And that's something that that was in their like their motto that they used to say before meetings. And how anger is perceived in activist issues around that are associated with women, or in which women are particularly prevalent. I just wondered if that had come out at all. I know there's like connections that are recognized between shame and anger, so I was wondering if that had, in this sort of feminist, like women's working women united, I don't know, I wondered if anger had been felt there, or
Yeah, there is definitely kind of like an overlapping politics of anger here for sure. It's kind of quite a few of the women talked about how angry they were. It was kind of seen as a way of transforming some of these emotions, like feeling alone or feeling shame, into something that might be more productive. With anger as a kind of way of there's a word which I always forget. Is it resentment? Is that right?
Yeah, resentment.
I apologize.
The righteous anger of the wronged, wrongly wronged.
But there's definitely something about this kind of this project being a way of like, yeah, taking those like supposedly unproductive emotions and pushing them somewhere else. It's quite the one thing that was missing is I didn't get much of a sense of the inappropriateness of anger for women, which is obviously something that comes out, that kind of or like affective injustice kind of stuff. You know, thinking about not what's said, but well, not just what's said, but kind of how you say it and what register your complaint is in. With obviously all kinds of attendant admonitions to police tone and things like that. Maybe because they were really not talking about men's experiences, there wasn't that kind of opportunity for contrast. It's interesting. I don't know whether anger in like an institutional context was just so unthinkable, but almost all of the you know, all of the things that I explored and that I read as well were of women like not wanting to cause a fuss and kind of, oh, I'm going to go to and kind of going to HR and saying, oh, I think this might be a bit of a problem, but and so kind of couching it in the most like almost like performatively reasonable and meek ways, and yet still having like extreme deleterious professional consequences. So it's a really, really interesting question.
Penelope?
Hey, how are you?
Very nice to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. Thanks so much for the talk. It was super interesting and really helpful. And I don't know exactly how to put this question, but I was thinking about your kind of narrative method and this kind of rebringing of the stories in, and something in Fricker that has been kind of puzzling me, which is her kind of dislike the claim that part of what hermeneutic and epistemic injustices do is prevent you from being who you are, or sort of like who you're supposed to be. And I don't know, I guess, what do you think about sort of using the narratives and how that maybe unsettles this sort of like idea that, you know, if you give someone the right words, then somehow they can become who they're supposed to be, like in a more fixed way. I guess I was thinking about the, you know, your sort of end points, and what it means to have sort of in becoming a case study. You kind of like, you know, the story is kind of like taken away, and even kind of what you were saying about like who is Wood then in this kind of bigger story. Does that make sense? I guess like
Yeah, no, completely. Sorry, I'm struggling slightly to kind of look up at the big screen and then come back and respond. Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. I think what's really interesting about the Carmita Wood case is that there are a lot of things which are kind of unknowable and which I think will stay unknowable because there's how Carmita Wood described them at the time, which sometimes are kind of really, really like vague. So, for example, about the first hearing, which so much of this stuff kind of hinges on, where she was asked why she left her job and she couldn't say, is like Carmita Wood, as far as I can work out, has never said more than that, and so it's not possible to know what happened in that room. Like, did she try and say something? Did she completely stay silent? Did she try and articulate it and fail? Like, there's not really there is a way of knowing, which is to get the documents, but then that's a kind of like weird official interpretation of what happened from the men who were judging her case. So that's not necessarily trustable either, but she leaves it as a kind of a black hole. But the problem is that it's really, really difficult to tell from the outside whether she had the language or something approximating the language and they just didn't care, or whether she didn't have the language at all or didn't deploy the language. So there's a kind of like for me, this kind of act of recovery is trying to get back to what we might possibly know from the archive. And then that's kind of, I think for me, a way of, like putting back in at least some of the things that she said and some of the things that were said about her, and then kind of letting that interfere with some of the kind of analysis and reanalysis that I'm kind of struggling with a little. Does that make sense?
yeah, no, thank you. I think that's really helpful, and just sort of I liked, the sort of active recovery as the term, because I think when I was reading the Fricker, I was sort of like, like how do you know who she's supposed to be, that the hermeneutic injustice is like preventing her from becoming, right? So I think the way you put it is really helpful.
I can ask a question. I mean, first of all, I just found it like kind of weird and puzzling that whether Carmita was black or not black is a question. Like, surely there is a way to find this out, right? Like, and it would make a difference. It feels like it would make a massive difference in terms of how her testimony would have been interpreted at the time because of racial injustice.
I really wanted to, sorry, no.
Yeah, no, that's my first bit in, but
I kind of failed to say something more intelligent about this at the time. But I think kind of what I was getting at is that it's kind of like intrinsically interesting that like hundreds, if not thousands of people know who this woman was. But then like, like I'm like scrabbling through obituary.com or whatever it is and like trying to find out about. So I think she died in 2015. I think she probably knew a little bit about that she'd been written. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if she knew that she'd been written about by like Lin Farley and Susan Brownmiller. But I very much doubt she knew that she'd been the kind of part of this explosion of scholarship on epistemic injustice. Maybe she did, but there's no kind of evidence of it. But they're just kind of like it took a long time to find out when she died, and even kind of basic facts about her life just aren't kind of really there. And to me, that's really interesting because as she's like this kind of phantom who just like comes and goes, and is kind of in, I don't know, like historical and then later philosophical contention for like 8-9 months of her life, maybe 3 or 4 years if you include the like period of harassment, right? But yeah, the whole black white thing is very, very strict. I mean, because I found a picture and then I found a number of philosophers saying that she was a black woman, including one philosopher saying that they didn't understand why people didn't make as much of the fact that she was a black woman, which arguably the answer is because she wasn't. But I don't know. But then how much do I trust a picture and a few words that I found on obituary?
Did you try emailing family?
There wasn't really a.
Yeah.
Hey, are you guys black? It's like, I don't know if that's.
Holly's got her hand up, so let
Yeah,
it go. I have an actual question as well.
Yeah, sure.
Javi, go ahead.
Thanks. No, just to say, Fred, Miranda's been in touch with the family and did some research.
Sure.
And to the best of my understanding, she was a white woman who was given an unusual name.
Okay.
But she had no particular connection to, African American or Black culture, as far as I remember. So maybe you could drop Miranda an email and ask her if she can help, because I'm pretty sure that she was in touch with the family, trying to get to the bottom of this question precisely, because it's only on the basis of her first name, isn't it, that people assumed stuff about her race. And there might be an interesting sort of family history there to make things more complicated for you.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you. I just kind of relatedly, I think I've only ever found Miranda Fricker talking about Susan Brownmiller's account. I didn't really know how much kind of digging she'd done around that. Had any of that? Has she ever written about that or spoken about it? About kind of any other attempts to get to the bottom of her life? Sorry, I know I'm not supposed to be the one asking the questions. I just wondered.
I don't know is the answer. I do know she really wanted to know, because obviously she's written on this figure, and then people said stuff about her, about how she understood that case, but I don't know if she's published on it. You can ask her, and then let everybody know.
Yeah,
I think there's probably worth, for your project, it seems quite significant to get clarity on that. And I mean, I don't know, you're the historian, but it strikes me that 2015 isn't that long ago.
No,
so
no.
She'll have family members and photo albums and
and
so on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Sounds like a research trip to America is in store.
No, I don't think so.
The question I had, I mean, this is sort of, again, like, hopefully not derailing from your talk, but like I've been doing some reflection and writing, as Arthur knows, recently on the idea of oppression and feminist kind of phenomenologies of oppression. And it's one of these terms that when you start thinking about, you're like, everyone uses it all the time, but no one's really defining it. And you used it several times in your talk of like, this oppression of sexual harassment or these kinds of violations that are so ordinary and mundane. And yeah, I guess the question, I mean, because I'm explicitly reflecting on this term and the kind of feminist genealogy of the term and how it's kind of fallen out of fashion. Like there's like a flurry of writing about oppression in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And then it's sort of, then we moved on to other terms like epistemic injustice, microaggressions, like there are other vocabularies to talk about this experience. So yeah, I guess the question is like, what do you mean by oppression?
It's always one of the things of being like when no one person can do a close genealogy of every word. So there's always going to be some maybe clumsy uses. I quite like oppression. There's like a weight to it. Like I don't know, it's sort of just completely anecdotal, but to me it sort of conjures someone like. Not completely passively either, but being like pressed. Yeah, pressed. It's probably just the word press. But that kind of being weighed down by something is I don't know whether that does kind of speak to me. I think I used it in this talk because I really wanted to communicate that this wasn't like horny men not being able to take no for an answer, that this was completely implicated in basically like there was, it didn't make it in, so but there was this one woman was talking about her experience and how throughout it she just thought, oh, I should have just stayed home and had kids. And it was just, that's what oppression was doing for me, was like, yeah, that's it, that's the point, is that it's sure it's sexualized, and sure it ties in with desire and what, you know, I'm just, all of this kind of stuff that's kind of perhaps more personal to the men doing it, but it is like a disciplinary thing. It is part of oppression. It is a way of telling women that they shouldn't be there. And I think that was, so like I kind of, like when I said that Carmita Wood was the first woman to do the job she was in, I think that's like, I didn't put that in there because I think it's impressive, although it is. I put it in there because I felt like Carmita Wood was like a kind of, I don't know, like a kind of a foreign body that Boyce McDaniel was trying to reject from his hyper-masculinized workplace. And then he was doing that in a kind of extremely weird sexual way, yes. But that it was like something much more deeper than that and layered into all these kind of other forms of oppression at the same time.
Yeah, no,
but
thank
yes,
you, but just
very much here for a genealogy of oppression. So yeah.
Just hearing you reflect on it was helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. As the person who so frequently is like, well, what do you mean by loneliness? You Fred Coopered me, and I tasted my own medicine. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Any other questions or comments, Arthur?
Yeah. I promised you that I'd ask you a difficult question. I won't fret you, but I will ask you, have you read John Forrester's Thinking in Cases?
No.
The reason I'm going to read some stuff out from that, because I think there's something there, and I'll get it wrong if I don't read it out. So that's the only reason why I wanted, is John Forrester's takes his starting point from this point that Ian Hacking makes, which is that styles of reasoning are curiously self-authenticating. A proposition can be assessed as true or false only when there's some style of reasoning and investigation that helps determine its truth value. So there's this idea that certain styles of reasoning need to be accepted as frameworks for types of reasoning before you can start to employ them to develop a sort of an epistemic framework, I guess. And what Forrester then does is say, well, what is it about? And then Hacking's point is that he gives these 6 styles of reasoning, and Forrester's contribution is to say, well, what is the psychoanalytic case study doing? And what does the case study do that is a style of reasoning distinct from these other styles of reasoning? So eventually he kind of comes up towards the end with this idea, the central theme for the study, though must for now run as follows: what are the specific modalities, historical, epistemological, political, by which reason?
Thank you.